You mentioned the Pink Ladies after so this is at the Epping Hotel, and this is one of several protests we saw up and down the country through the summer, although perhaps the most famous example of local communities protesting against illegal migrants being put up in local hotels. Mm-hmm. And the Pink Ladies thing seems to be interesting. You basically alluded to what I had taken of it is it's a strange sort of turning point. It seemed to me to be a bit of a turning point where women are actually now standing up against the traditional progressive line.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you shared that sort of opinion. That is it a significant moment, the Pink Ladies?
I think, again, the class factor is really strong.
But aren't the Pink Ladies more working class women?
That's what I mean.
But so it's not actually a turning point for the more progressive elite types.
Well, I guess it's a turning point in that they're more normal working class people are more confident in showing up at these protests and being very vocal. But yes, in terms of something I've noticed, if you ever watch Vox Pops at these migrant hotel protests, you can immediately tell just based on accent what side someone's on. Have you noticed?
No, I hadn't noticed that. Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Like basically consistently. And I've noted actually with this summer's various protests that they've disproportionately happened in ex-Cockney areas, i.e. places where people who used to live in, working class people who used to live in London have migrated to. So Essex, obviously, but also Dis in Norfolk has quite a lot of ex-Cockneys.
Let's be clear on that. These are Cockneys who have been moved from their traditional East London home out to these areas and constituencies that are further away from London.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, displaced, there's a whole story there about why they've been displaced. And it's overwhelmingly to do with government policies, to do with housing and mass immigration.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so there's an existing resentment against the government on that basis. I think that this is quite often mistaken for a resentment against immigrants themselves. And normally that's actually not true. Obviously there are exceptions. But if you speak to the people who show up at these protests or you watch interviews with them or whatever, people will very rarely, if ever, express animosity towards immigrants themselves. Obviously towards, sex offenders in the hotels, yes. But in general, the resentment is directed towards the government and towards elite natives who are I really do think that so much of this is class war. Like, I keep going on about this because I think it's important. I think that the real rift here is between elite natives and working class natives. And working class native Londoners were displaced from London. They're not. It's worth emphasising that Essex is actually Essex is it's the place where most Cockneys ended up. And Essex is a prosperous place, is a successful place. A lot of people have actually ended up doing very well for themselves. They've got bigger houses than they would have done if they'd stayed in the East End, right? So it's not a entirely tragic story of destitution or anything like that. But it is still the case that, London is now less than a third white British.
Well, I worked in Tower Hamlets in Bow through the pandemic. Yeah. And this is an area where it was London's poorer native groups whose parents are still there to some extent, or the elder generations are still there, but the government prioritised giving council houses and homes to new incomers, particularly the Bengali population. So then a whole generation of indigenous Londoners did not have a place, so they had to move out whilst maybe their mum or grandma was still living in town. So you're suggesting that set the groundwork, that sort of set the emotional groundwork for what we're seeing play out. That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
So the key legislative change that happened was in the 70s. I forget exactly the year, but there was the Housing Act, or sometime in the mid-70s. The crucial thing that happened was that social housing has existed I think a lot of people overseas don't realise this. An enormous amount of London housing stock is social housing, which is to say it's subsidised housing, often much, much cheaper than market housing, which is available, which is regulated either by charities or by local authorities. So there's a centralised allocation system. And this emerged at the beginning of the 20th century as a place to house people because of slum clearances. So slums were cleared because of disease, and new buildings were created, often quite nice. Like the earliest housing estates are actually really quite nice. And they were intended always not for the poorest of the poor. They were intended for the kind of upper working class, like the respectable poor, to use Victorian terminology. And that remained, and there was a feeling that, and also the difference between market rent and social housing rent wasn't as enormous as it is now. So there wasn't as much of a disparity. But there was a feeling that you could get social housing if you had paid into the community. If you were locally respectable, you had family, you had a job, you were deserving of this community benefit. That was how it was regarded in the old East End. And we're talking here about 30, 40% sometimes of social housing units in the inner London boroughs being social housing. And then the big change happens in the 1970s when the Housing Act changes the criteria that local authorities are supposed to use to allocate housing. And instead of having this system of local reputations and of respectable working class, the feeling of paying in. Instead, it's allocated on the basis of need. So if you're jobless, you're more likely to get a house. If you're a single mother, you're more likely to get a house. If you've just arrived as a refugee, you're more likely to get a house. And so all of a sudden, that system of paying in, a national law comes in and obliterates it. And that's when you see this wave. So in Tower Hamlets, you see this wave of, there's a great book about this called The New East End that was written by a group of academics, including Toby Young's father, Michael Young, who of course coined the term meritocracy. But they did this really in-depth study of what happened in Tower Hamlets. And yes, you ended up seeing there had already been a small community of Bengali men who'd been living in Tower Hamlets and often living in very crowded tenements. They couldn't access social housing, and working in the textile trade or in restaurants. All of a sudden, they could access social housing and they could bring their wives and their children over, and then they would bring their extended families over. And you saw this massive wave of Bengali immigrants arriving in the East End, and this was true also for other groups in other parts of London. And the Cockneys left. Quite quickly, and actually relatively peacefully. I mean, there were occasional instances of interethnic violence.
I mean, that's where the BNP started. All those pubs BNP pubs are on that stretcher from Bow Church. Not, I think it's called St Mary's Church.
The BNP was born out of that phenomenon. Absolutely, you can still see. I wrote an article about this recently for First Things, and I went and looked at questions posed by BNP councillors to London Mayor, who at the time was Boris Johnson, and they're asking questions like, "Are you worried about Cockneys dying out in London?" Boris Johnson says no. Are you worried about, the ethnic replacement of London's working class? Boris Johnson says no. And the BNP ended up failing in their political efforts in the East End. This is often attributed to, better arguments being made by the left. But actually, I think the reason the BNP failed is because all their voters moved. And they ended up going. So by the end of the 20th century, there'd been this enormous exodus, and now, so of the white British people who remain in London, they're rich people generally. So you have London. Basically, anyone who lives in London or walks the streets of London will know this: that London is composed of affluent white people, white British people, I should say, and then a massive assortment of different other groups, some rich, some poor. But social housing stock is very disproportionately occupied by people who've arrived relatively recently. Either they've personally arrived or their parents did. But it's not occupied by Cockneys. So Cockneys have gone out to places like Essex, Norfolk, Surrey, Sussex, all of the kind of surrounding counties. And it's those places which have been most likely to see migrant hotel protests. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Okay, so it's because those families already have a history of problems with the policies towards supporting immigration or immigrants.
Yeah.
they already have a psychological predisposition to be sensitive to such behaviour.
Yeah, and obviously that will be interpreted by the left as them being racist. I think that that's not quite right. I think what they have is an antagonistic relationship towards government policy and a feeling, which is not unfair, that the government don't really care about them, don't see their communities as worthy of protection, don't see their concerns as legitimate. And I think that's so much of what's motivating what we're seeing in British politics.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode, and for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.